The heirs then would get the advantage of what we called a step up in basis at date of death value, provided that their assets are in a revocable trust. Those assets then get the value at the date of death, simply stated. And at that point, there are the different options. They begin to redepreciate those assets because they have a fresh start on their balance sheet, essentially. So the assets would be available for depreciation. The land would be available to get a valuation of the nutrient values we discussed before. So the new heirs will be afforded depreciation, nutrient value, fertilizer, and other options for their tax benefits.
A lot of times when we're running through this financial planning process, one of the big things that we're looking for is trying to make sure that mom and dad are financially independent, especially if they're starting to want to make gifts. So basis becomes very relevant. Do mom and dad have to sell certain assets to become financially independent? What Sean mentioned before, a lot of our farm families specifically have been able to utilize that bonus 179 depreciation, which if they have to sell those assets to become financially independent, they're having to recapture all that depreciation or ordinary income. So if there's other ways or other assets that we can use to make sure that mom and dad are financially independent and not have to sell a depreciating asset to become financially independent, that may make sense. And that's why we're working with the accountant and understanding, okay, what type of planning's been done? What assets can we use to make sure mom and dad are financially independent there? The other aspect is when you're working this again, specifically with farm families, is trying to say, okay, if we're going to be able to gift assets down to the next generation, maybe that next generation is capable of taking over and we want to start making gifts. How important is basis to that active farm child? Because if we're going to start gifting, 80 acres, 120 acres, 200 acres to that next generation, that active farm child, a lot of times maybe mom and dad are worried about, that step up in basis. Well, maybe that step up in basis isn't that important because the active farm child's never going to sell it. And if the active farm child's never going to sell it, retaining mom and dad's basis for what mom and dad paid for it maybe is not that important. But if we know we have an inactive child that is going to turn around and sell that asset, well, then basis becomes very important. And that step up in basis is important because if they do turn around and sell it, they got to step up in basis, and thus we're working with the CPA, we're reducing that tax on the sale of that asset.